Hi, I'm Morgan and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of March 2020. I read 11 books this month, which is kind of a lot, so don't get used to it. I was really surprised at the end of the month when I realised I'd made it through that many, and then I remembered that all of my lecturers were on strike, so that makes more sense. I'm going to be talking about them in the order that I read them, not in any ranked order, but I will be telling you what star rating I gave the book. The first book that I read in the month of March was The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil by John McGrath. I think it's a Cheviot, I think it might be the Cheviot, I don't know, but it is a sheep, that's what I do know. I read this for my 20th century literature class and I gave it 4 stars. It's a play about the political situation in Scotland, running from the Highland clearances all the way up to the North Sea oil boom in 1973. And it mostly focuses on how the working class people of Scotland were affected by those in power changing things in our country. Obviously I enjoyed it, I gave it 4 stars, but it was a bit of a different read. It's not really like anything I've read before. I like the form that it was written in. It was very Brechtian. It refused the realism that you would expect from a stage play. For those of you who have never heard that word before, Brechtian refers to the director Bertolt Brecht, who was writing in the early 20th century. He used alienation techniques to force the audience to consider his message and to really think about it instead of getting lost in the play. McGrath also uses alienating techniques to force the audience to remember that this is a real situation that he's talking about. He's talking about real things that happened to the Scottish people. And this makes the audience, or in my case the reader, more aware of the implications of the scenes that he is portraying in this play. As a Scottish person, I enjoyed learning about some history that I didn't really know about. I didn't really know about the way the North Sea oil boom truly affected the working class people in our country, especially those who live on the coast. And I also really enjoyed the inclusion of the Gaelic language. McGrath chose to include songs and parts of the speech in the native Scottish language, particularly because a lot of it is about the Highlands, where that is still a language that is spoken today and has always been. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I would recommend it if you are into that kind of theatre, or you just want to learn a bit more about Scotland. The next book I read in March was The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. I read this for my writing war class and I gave it 5 stars. It was one of the best things I had to read for that class. I really enjoyed it. Particularly because I was learning about a war that I didn't really know anything about. This is about the Vietnam War, particularly from the American side, but I did also read about the Vietnamese side, which I'll get to later in the video. I enjoyed this book because I felt like I was in the character of Tim's head, and the way it was written, I felt like I could understand him, or at least understand the feelings that he was experiencing when looking back at all of the things that he went through and that his fellow soldiers went through. There was a good contrast between the good and the bad aspects of war. It didn't romanticise war, but still recognised that soldiers can find something good in war. I read a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger for this class too that I really didn't like because it overly romanticised war, and its recognition of what soldiers can gain from being part of a close-knit group. It romanticised war, whereas I feel like this had a lot better contrast between them and made it clear that these things are not mutually exclusive. I also really enjoyed the character of Mary Ann because a lot of war books reduce women to a cardboard cutout or just to a sexual object, but Mary Ann was allowed to experience war in the way that the men were. She was allowed to be affected by it in the way that the men were, which really isn't common for war literature, or at least what I've read of war literature. So I was really glad to read about a woman without her being reduced to a stereotype. The next book I read in March was Loitering with Intent by Muriel Spark. I gave this book 3 stars. It was fine, it wasn't bad. I read it quite quickly. I feel like I should put a disclaimer in here that I did read it on a 7-hour bus journey to Birmingham, surrounded by 5 of my poetry friends who were really, really good at distracting me. So I don't know if I was to read it again, I might get something else out of it, but you know, it didn't capture me in that way. I did enjoy it. It was a kind of convoluted plot, but you know, it was fun. I read this for my 20th century literature class. I found that I'm not the biggest fan of strain of consciousness writing, which this isn't overly, but it does have that in it. It has Fleur, who's the main character, it has her thinking about different aspects of her life and linking them all together, and I don't always find that enrapturing. I'm not always drawn in by that. I also didn't really like the main character Fleur. I thought she was kind of annoying and a little selfish, but I think that was part of the point, that she was an unreliable narrator. I just didn't really like her. And as I said, the plot was a little convoluted, but it was fun. It was a fun plot. That in itself didn't lose me, so I think that's why I read it so quickly and kind of devoured it, because it's quite small, but I did read it really quickly. It's also a book about a writer, which I am not the biggest fan of. I don't really like reading about writers. Which is kind of a funny thing to say, as I myself am a writer, but I feel like there can be an element of self-indulgence in those kind of books, and that's not really something that I'm here for. So I did enjoy it, and overall I would recommend. The next book I read was When She Woke by Hilary Jordan. Now, I don't have a physical copy of this because I read it on my Overdrive account that I get through my library, and I would definitely recommend that you look into getting one. Particularly in this time of quarantine, because it's great. You get to download ebooks for free. Obviously you have to give them back because it is a library service, but it's a lot easier than having to go to your own local library, which can be, you know, hard to get to, especially in times of quarantine. And for some people that's just not really feasible, whether it be for transport issues or because you just don't like talking to receptionists, which is me. I gave this book 2 stars. It was wild. It was a wild ride. I will give it that. The basic premise of this book is that when you commit a crime, instead of going to jail, you are chromed, which means your skin colour is changed, which sounds a bit dubious, but it's changed to like bright red or bright blue or bright green. And each of these colours represents a different crime, and in this case we have the character of Hannah, who is chromed, and she is a red, which means she committed a murder. Spoiler alert for this, because I'm not going to not talk about it considering it is at the very beginning of the book, but the murder that Hannah committed is abortion. Now, when I started this, I thought it would be an exploration of abortion rights, of the rights of a woman over her own body, and kind of looking at what could happen if the church, or not just the Catholic Church, which I think it is supposed to be the Catholic Church, or like an offshoot of Christianity, but any kind of like ruling body who is ruled by those kind of philosophical ideals and feels like they can tell people what to do with their bodies, like if they were in charge. It kind of feels less of a what if now, after a lot of things that were happening in America recently, than it probably was when Hilary Jordan wrote it. I believe she wrote it in like 2011 or something like that. So it was a lot more real to me, which kind of made it more hard-hitting. And it would have continued to be, I think, had it not gone in the direction that it did. Because as I said, this book is wild. It was actually a really short book. I think it was only 300 and something pages, and that was on my phone. So it was really short. I read it really quickly. I also read this when I was in Birmingham mostly. So I was reading it in between activities and on buses and that kind of thing. And I think the biggest issue for me was that there were so many arcs going on at once, so many different plot threads, that I was not invested in any of them. And I was kind of like, okay, why are we immediately moving on to something else? You never actually finished talking about that other thing. Can we go back to that? There was the issue of Hannah now being a red because of her abortion. There was the issue of her abortion itself and the fact that she had to get it illegally, and all of that was kind of wrapped up in her religion and how she feels about her religion. There was also her illicit relationship with the pastor and how that influenced her life. And then there was when she went to the weird kind of religious place for rehabilitating girls who'd been chromed. That was really weird, and once she left it was just kind of never talked about again. And then there were secret underground rebels who were trying to help girls like Hannah who had had abortions and then been persecuted for murder. There was so much going on for such a short book, and I didn't really feel connected to any of the plot lines or any of the characters. Even Hannah, who is our protagonist, like, she was fine, but she kind of felt a bit wishy-washy to me. Oh, sorry, someone's getting a food delivery. I saw one of those big, like, food delivery vans from, like, Tesco or something. Quarantine, stay inside. But yeah, Hannah felt quite wishy-washy to me. Like, she wasn't a pure concrete character that I could identify, and one minute she was like, oh no, I feel really, really bad for going against my religion, and then she was like, you know what, I don't care anymore. And it didn't even seem like a realistic difference to me. I didn't feel like we got enough of her own internal struggle. I feel like it was the changes in her mind and her feelings were very quick, and that kind of goes along with the plot being really quick and it all kind of happening at once, and I was just like, no. So overall 2 stars. I wouldn't say it's terrible. The writing was okay, like there was no issues about that. It was easy to read, it was easy to understand. The writing itself never put me off finishing a book, but it was a wild ride. The next book I read was The Sorrow of War by Bao Nin. I may be completely pronouncing that wrong. Please tell me if I am. I don't want to offend. This was also a book that I read for my writing war class, and I gave it 3 stars. I read this book after The Things They Carried, and it was also about the Vietnam War, but through the side of a Vietnamese soldier as opposed to an American soldier, which I think was really good that we studied both, because a lot of coverage of the Vietnam War, or at least what I've seen as a Scottish person, is through the lens of the Americanised way and the American soldiers, and very much ignores the suffering of the Vietnamese people. I didn't even know what the actual Vietnam War was about until I read these books and looked it up for this class. So I definitely enjoyed the point of view. I enjoyed learning about Vietnamese soldiers and the fact that they went through the same sort of struggles that the American soldiers did. I liked the main character, Kien, I believe is his name, and I liked that we saw his survivor's guilt throughout the novel. He has lived through a lot of horrible things from a very young age, and most of his fellow soldiers, people that he fought with, have died or been hurt, and he has to live with the fact that he's still alive and the war is over and it's all done now and he can't go back to change things. It's clear that this has left him with a deep trauma, which I think made the character extremely sympathetic, and honestly I think that's what made me enjoy the book, that he wasn't just a tough guy soldier, which you get in a lot of war narratives. He was just a man who was trying his best. However, I did give this 3 stars, and it was mainly because of the portrayal of women in the novel. It's not the worst I've read, but it was definitely bad. I felt like the women were caricatures, and there wasn't a lot of them, but when they were, they didn't feel, you know, super fully formed. They're also mostly just there to suffer, and particularly there are quite a few instances of sexual assault, which I really didn't enjoy. Obviously no one's gonna enjoy that, but because there was no other space for the female characters, it made it a lot worse because that was kind of all they did. And Ken's childhood sweetheart, who is probably the main female character, kind of felt like a weird manic pixie dream girl-esque thing. She just didn't feel like a fully formed person to me, but that might just be a personal thing, because she definitely was included in the narrative, which was a really good thing. I just didn't like the way she was portrayed. Another reason that I gave it 3 stars is more of a criticism of the edition than the actual novel itself. I think that since this is a translation of the original novel, I felt a disconnect. I felt a lot of the phrasing was kind of clunky, and I think that was due to translation more than anything, but it did pull me out of. So the next book I read wasn't really a book, it was a chapbook of poetry. It was Some Ending by Ben Norris. As I mentioned, I went to Birmingham. It was for a competition called Unislam, which is a poetry slam competition that goes on in the UK, and it's for universities to take part in. And the great thing about going there is getting to meet all of these amazing poets and hear their amazing poetry, one of which is Ben Norris, who's one of the organisers of Unislam, I think. He's involved in it all, that's all I know. Ben is an amazing poet and I really, really like his poetry. I liked being able to read a little selection of them instead of just hearing like 1 or 2. But it is spoken word poetry and I think it kind of loses something when it's down on the page, which is why I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 stars, because I really do love Ben's poetry. I love the way he writes. And I think since I've heard quite a few of them performed, they just weren't as like hard-hitting to me because I've already heard them and I've seen them perform live, so when you're reading them you don't quite get the same thing out of them. But it was really good and I would recommend getting a copy. All I know is that I can get it from him in person. I don't know if you can get them online, but they're good. So support living poets. The next book that I read in March was The Passage by Justin Cronin. This is a very large book. Very large. So I gave The Passage 5 stars. I loved it. I cried a little, which tells you all you need to know. I love dystopian and apocalyptic literature, and I love that it was vampires here, which is kind of different. A lot of the time it'll be zombies or a virus or something like that, but instead we saw vampires ruining the world, so great. I liked that they had a lot of traditional attributes of vampires, you know, aversion to light and all that kind of thing. I loved the character of Amy, who's one of the kind of overarching main important people. I loved her. She was such a small, poor, devastating child and she deserves so much more. There's the postman. He's wearing gloves. Bye, Mr. Postman. And overall I was actually really drawn in by the characters. I think the characterisation was really good, which would have to be in a book this large. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series to get to see more of the little family unit that we have at the end and to see what Amy's really capable of and to see her grow into her own and learn how to use her powers and her abilities for the good of everybody else. I think one criticism I did have was that in the middle there was kind of a part where we got a lot of extraneous character information about characters who weren't, you know, ones that we were following, and it was kind of useful for the plot, but at the same time I don't think we needed to know as much about them as Justin Cronin gave us. It doesn't mean it was bad, it kind of was a lull in the middle and I got a little bored and I was like, why are you telling me all this? I just want to get back to the story. Bring me back to the people I'm caring about. So I did feel kind of out of place and kind of gave me a lull in the middle. I was like, oh, I need to go and read this. Like I'd be like, oh, I need to pick this up and finish it. But once I got past that, I was back to loving it again. And I'm really excited for the other 2. The next book I read in March was Jazz by Toni Morrison. I read this book for my 20th century literature class, sensing a theme here. This is the first Toni Morrison book that I've picked up, but I am actually looking forward to picking up more of her stuff. I like the way she writes. I actually really enjoyed Jazz. I did have some of the kind of 20th century tropes that I'm not a big fan of, kind of a running commentary, a jumping back and forth, and linking scenes together but not really making it clear that we're jumping back and forth. So I'm not the biggest fan of that, but I did prefer the way Morrison did it to the way quite a few of the other authors that I read did it. I think the best part about this was the characters. I think they were really interesting and their relationships were really interesting. I wanted to know more about them and how they relate to each other, and kind of looking at the idea of why people stay together, particularly for black people in, I believe it was the 20s. Yeah, it's like the 1920s because it's jazz era, obviously. So that had a lot of significance for particularly working class people of colour in America, and I was just really interesting to read about that, which is obviously why Toni Morrison wrote about it, because she herself wanted to explore it, and I'm really glad that I got to read it. So the next book that I read was Redeployment by Phil Clay. I did not like this. I gave it 2 stars and I read it for my writing war class, and honestly if I didn't have to read it for class I probably wouldn't have finished it. This was the last book I had to read and it was the most modern book that I read. It focuses on soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. Actually, I don't know why I said Afghanistan first, it was mostly Iraq with a little bit of Afghanistan. But it was definitely modern soldiers and it was a modern war book. I had quite a few reasons for not liking this, one of which being that within the first 4 pages it used the F slur twice. Whew! Did not set me on the right foot. Really made me uncomfortable and I was like, let's not. Particularly because it was used in a negative context. You know, some people, I'm not going to get into the concept of reclaiming slurs and things like that, but that wasn't this, and I know that it was the way they spoke back then. Back then was less than 20 years ago, so I don't care. I also really didn't like the way women were portrayed in this novel. They were mostly just there to be sexual objects, whether that was the wives of the soldiers or the sex workers mentioned. They were just sexualized. There was no woman existing as her own person, which I really didn't like. I made quite a few notes when I was reading it, just basically being like, why is this being sexualized? Why is this being sexualized? Why is this being sexualized? Even the character of Zara, who is quite present in one of the short stories, and is there as a kind of narrative foil. She's against the main character and they're having to try and learn to understand each other. She is still sexualized the moment we meet her. He describes her body in detail and he talks about how he would love to sleep with her, and I just hated it. It just made me so uncomfortable. When people say that you can tell when it's a man writing a woman, this is what they mean. Also, it's a book of short stories, but the voices were very samey. I couldn't differentiate between them very easily. There's not a massive blurb on the back, so when I started reading them and it seemed like it was the same character talking, I was like, oh, okay, it's a bunch of short stories but they're all about the one person. It's not. It's about a bunch of different soldiers who play a bunch of different roles within their like squadron or platoon or whatever you call it. They're all different people. There's a chaplain, there's a gunner, there's all kinds of things. They kind of just felt like one man, which did not endear them to me at all. I was looking for different points of view. I think the only one that really stood out as different was the chaplain, and I think that was because he was, you know, talking a lot about his religion and how that related to him being in the army. But apart from that, I just didn't care. I really didn't care about any of these guys or any of their stories because they were just saying stuff that made me not like them. And that doesn't make me care about your plight. That sounds so callous, but It's true. Even in The Sorrow of War, which I didn't like the portrayal of women there, I actually cared about the main character. I felt sorry for him, I sympathised with him, and I wanted to know what was going on, how he got out of the life that he was living. But here I just didn't care. So honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. I didn't like it, especially if you're a woman. So the next book I read in the month of March was Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare. This is a quite well-known Shakespeare play. It's a comedy, I believe. I believe, I've read it. And I gave it 4 stars. I have been working my way through Shakespeare and I actually really enjoy it. I enjoy Renaissance plays. I think that they're really interesting, and it's really interesting to see how drama and literature has changed from then till now. And Shakespeare's just good. It's fun, it's interesting, there are some great characters. And I gave this 4 stars, which means it's one of the ones that I mostly enjoyed. I don't think I've given a Shakespeare play less than 3 stars, sorry. Might have given one 2 stars, but it's mostly Shakespeare plays for me are 3 stars, 4 stars, depending on how much I enjoyed them. So I did enjoy this. I love the characters of Beatrice and Benedict and their relationship. It's got a great line, which you may or may not know, about eating his heart in the marketplace. Is that why I read the book? Maybe. You don't need to know that. This is a Shakespeare play that I would love to see on stage. I think that a lot of the humour would come through easier, because it can be hard to get the humour and to really find it funny when you're reading it, because you're reading it for comprehension. So maybe if I was to read it again, I would find it funnier, and probably if I saw it on stage I would laugh the whole time. But I really enjoyed it and I would recommend. And the last book that I read in March was Grief Lessons by Anne Carson. This is a book of translations by Anne Carson, obviously, of Euripides plays, particularly Heracles? Hecube? I always pronounce them wrong. Heracles, Hecube, Hippolytus, and Alcestis. There you go. I enjoyed this. I love to read translations of Greek plays. It's something that I'm really interested in, particularly female characters from Greek myths. I like that they often have actual roles, which is kind of surprising. You wouldn't expect it, but they do. So I gave it 4 stars because I loved the first 2 plays. I loved Heracles and Hecube. I keep saying Hecuba. That's not that. It's from the... what's it from? That's from The Crucible, I think. Either way, it's not the name of the play. But I loved both of them, and I definitely would read them again. But it's the other 2, I can't pronounce this one. Hippolytus and Alcestis, I didn't enjoy as much. Hippolytus, it was fine. I think just as a play I didn't really enjoy it. Anne Carson's translations always are really good, but I just didn't really enjoy the play. And Alcestis was good as well, but kind of weird. It's a Greek play. I don't know why I'm saying kind of weird. They're all weird. I just didn't find the second 2 as engaging and enrapturing as the first 2, which is why I gave it 4 stars and not 5 stars. I really enjoyed the translation of Hecube in particular because I've read another translation of that was not as good. It's quite an old translation, which is probably why, but I really liked this one. And that is the 11 books that I read in the month of March. I was really surprised that I got a couple of 5 stars and a couple of 2 stars. Neither of those are really common for me. I tend to stick with the 3 and 4 stars, but there was a couple of books that I loved and a couple of books that I really didn't love. So hopefully I'll get that kind of range for the rest of the year, but probably not. If you've made it to the end, thank you for watching. Let me know down in the comments if you agree with any of my thoughts on these books or you disagree, if you like them, if you didn't like them, if you want to read them. Let me know. If you want to see more about what I'm reading on a daily basis, you can check out my Goodreads, which will be linked in the description. You can also check out my Twitter and my Instagram. Feel free to come talk to me, I'll come talk to you. We can just chat in the DMs because we are modern children and we're in quarantine. Thanks for watching. Bye!